At 0620 on November 1st, 1943, Sergeant John Henderson crouched in the tangled root system of a banyan tree 400 yards inland from Empress Augusta Bay, Bougainville, watching a Japanese artillery forward observer through his M1903A4 Springfield's Unearth 8x scope. 28 years old, 2 Pacific campaigns, 14 confirmed sniper kills across Guadalcanal and Tarawa. Zero interest in becoming number 15 for the Japanese counter-sniper teams now hunting him. Henderson had volunteered for the 3rd Marine Division Scout-Sniper Platoon in March 1943 after watching regular infantry get shredded by hidden Japanese machine gun nests on Guadalcanal. He'd grown up hunting deer and coyotes in the mountains outside Flagstaff, Arizona, worked as a hunting guide before the war, spent summers tracking elk across terrain most men couldn't navigate. Now he was part of a specialized 12-man sniper section attached to the 9th Marines, tasked with eliminating Japanese officers, artillery observers, and machine gun crews during the Bougainville invasion. The island was 125 miles long, covered in dense jungle, volcanic ridges, and swamps that turned men's boots into rotting leather within days. Japanese 17th Army, 40,000 troops, had spent 8 months fortifying the interior, building concealed artillery positions, interconnected bunkers, and defensive networks designed to bleed the Americans white. And now, 6 days into the invasion, Henderson had become the most hunted man in his sector. If you want to see how Henderson survived what came next, hit that like button. It helps us bring these forgotten stories to more people. Subscribe if you haven't already. We're rescuing history one video at a time. Back to Henderson and the 900 rounds of Japanese artillery about to rain down on his position. The Japanese artillery observer was 380 yards away, partially concealed behind a moss-covered log on the jungle ridge overlooking the marine perimeter. Henderson could see the man's binoculars, his map case, the radio operator crouched beside him. This was the 3rd observer team Henderson had tracked in 2 days. The first 2 had died without ever knowing he was there. Single shots through the chest at dawn when the light was flat and muzzle flash was nearly invisible against the jungle canopy. But this 3rd team had learned. They were moving every 20 minutes, changing positions, using the terrain. The observer never stayed exposed longer than 15 seconds. Henderson waited. Patience was the only advantage a sniper had against an enemy that outnumbered him 200 to 1. The jungle around him was alive with sound. Birds, insects, the distant crack of rifle fire from the marine perimeter 800 yards east. The temperature was already 95 degrees Fahrenheit with 80% humidity. Sweat soaked through his marine dungarees, but he didn't move. Movement killed snipers faster than enemy bullets. The observer rose slightly, scanning the marine lines with his binoculars. Henderson exhaled slowly, centered the crosshairs on the man's upper chest, began his trigger squeeze. The rifle cracked. The 150-grain M2 ball round crossed 380 yards in 0.4 seconds and struck the observer just below the collarbone. The man dropped. The radio operator grabbed for his weapon. Henderson had already cycled the bolt, ejecting the spent casing. He fired again. The radio operator fell backward into the vegetation. 2 kills, 4 seconds. Then Henderson heard it, the distant thump of artillery firing. The Japanese had triangulated his position from the muzzle flash. He had maybe 12 seconds before the first rounds landed. Every Marine sniper instructor at Camp Lejeune had drilled the same doctrine into Henderson's head. 2 shots maximum, then relocate at least 200 yards. Staying in position after shooting was suicide. The artillery was coming. Henderson should have been running, but he didn't move. Because 40 yards to his right, concealed in a cluster of ferns and rotting logs, was what Henderson called a goose zone, a depression in the jungle floor created by an old bomb crater, now filled with decomposing vegetation and covered by a natural canopy of vines. The crater was deep enough to provide overhead cover from artillery airbursts, positioned in a micro-terrain fold that made it invisible from the Japanese ridge and connected to Henderson's current position by a shallow drainage ditch he'd scavenged 3 days earlier. Henderson heard the incoming shells, the distinctive whistle that made men's bowels loosen with fear. He low-crawled through the drainage ditch, moving fast but staying below the vegetation line. He reached the ghost zone and dropped into it just as the first Japanese 75mm shells detonated. The artillery barrage was methodical and devastating. 32 rounds in 90 seconds, all targeted on the banyan tree where Henderson had fired from. The jungle erupted in explosions, shrapnel tearing through trees, dirt and debris raining down. The ghost zone shook, but the overhead canopy absorbed the airburst fragments. Henderson pressed himself into the crater's deepest point and waited. The barrage ended. Silence, except for the ringing in Henderson's ears and the crackling of fires where the shells had ignited dry vegetation. Henderson waited 5 more minutes, then slowly raised his head above the crater rim. The banyan tree was gone, shredded into splinters. The entire area where he'd been positioned was cratered and smoking. If he'd followed doctrine and tried to relocate 200 yards through the jungle, he'd be dead. The artillery would have caught him in the open. But the ghost zone had saved him, and the Japanese artillery observers now believed they'd killed him. Henderson smiled. The hunt was just beginning. For the next 4 days, Henderson operated in a 600-yard sector between the Marine perimeter and the Japanese defensive ridge. He never stayed in the same position longer than 2 kills. He never shot more than twice from any location, and he always had a pre-positioned ghost zone within 40 yards of every firing position. The technique was counterintuitive and violated every sniper doctrine Henderson had been taught. Traditional tactics emphasized constant movement, shoot and relocate immediately to avoid counter-battery fire. But Henderson had realized something crucial during his first week on Bougainville. Constant movement through dense jungle created noise, broke vegetation patterns, and left trails that Japanese scouts could follow. The jungle itself was too thick for rapid relocation to be effective. By the time a sniper moved 200 yards through the undergrowth, Japanese artillery could saturate the entire area. Henderson's ghost zone system inverted the problem. Instead of running after shooting, he'd pre-position multiple concealed fallback positions within short crawling distance of his firing point. After engaging, he'd move laterally into a ghost zone, often less than 50 yards away, and let the Japanese artillery destroy the position he'd just left. The artillery observers would report mission success. Japanese command would believe the sniper was dead, and Henderson would wait in his ghost zone until nightfall, then move to a completely different sector to repeat the process. By November 3rd, Henderson had 11 confirmed kills. Japanese patrols were actively hunting for his body, believing they'd killed him 3 separate times. They found nothing. On November 4th, Henderson killed a Japanese company commander at 520 yards, the longest shot he'd attempted on Bougainville. The commander had been moving between defensive positions along the ridge, accompanied by 4 bodyguards. Henderson had been tracking the group for 90 minutes, waiting for the right moment. When the commander paused to consult a map, Henderson fired. The 150-grain round struck the commander in the head. The bodyguards scattered. Henderson fired twice more, hitting one bodyguard in the chest. Then he heard the artillery, multiple batteries this time, heavier caliber. The Japanese were throwing everything at his position. Henderson crawled into his pre-positioned ghost zone 35 yards away and waited as over 140 rounds of 75mm and 105mm artillery obliterated the hillside where he'd been shooting from. The barrage lasted 8 minutes. Trees were shredded, the jungle canopy collapsed, entire sections of vegetation were vaporized by high-explosive shells. Henderson's ghost zone, a narrow fissure in volcanic rock covered by fallen logs, remained untouched. When the barrage ended, Henderson waited until dusk, then moved 800 yards south to a completely different sector. The Japanese would spend the next day searching for his corpse in the wrong location. By November 5th, other Marine snipers in the 3rd Division had started asking Henderson about his technique. The official casualty reports showed Henderson with 18 confirmed kills and 0 injuries, despite being targeted by Japanese artillery at least 6 times. Other snipers were being wounded or killed trying to follow standard doctrine, relocating rapidly after shooting, only to get caught in artillery barrages or ambushed by Japanese patrols during movement. Henderson started teaching his ghost zone method informally. Scout a sector for 24 hours before engaging, identify natural micro-terrain features that provide overhead cover, old craters, rock fissures, dense vegetation clusters, fallen trees. Pre-position 3 to 5 ghost zones within 50 yards of planned firing positions. After engaging, move laterally into the nearest ghost zone, wait for the artillery, then relocate during darkness. The technique spread Marine to Marine, never appearing in official training manuals, but saving lives nonetheless. And the Japanese artillery kept falling on empty positions, convinced they were killing American snipers who were already gone. On November 6th, Henderson's sector changed. The 9th Marines were pushing toward Piva Trail, a narrow jungle path that connected Japanese defensive positions along the inland ridge system. Intelligence reported heavy Japanese activity along the trail, supply columns, reinforcement units, and at least 2 artillery batteries repositioning to support the defensive perimeter. Henderson's orders were simple: interdict Japanese movement along Piva Trail, kill officers, artillery observers, radio operators, and anyone who looked important. Higher command wanted the Japanese supply line disrupted. Henderson moved into position before dawn, establishing a primary firing point 450 yards from a section of Piva Trail where the jungle canopy thinned slightly, just enough to provide shooting lanes. He'd scouted this position 2 days earlier, identifying 4 ghost zones within crawling distance. The trail was busy. Henderson counted 37 Japanese soldiers moving north in the first hour, supply bearers carrying ammunition boxes, mortar crews hauling their tubes, infantry reinforcements heading toward the perimeter. He let them pass. Killing enlisted men wasn't the mission. He was hunting for officers and observers, high-value targets whose deaths would disrupt Japanese command structure. At 0740, Henderson saw what he'd been waiting for: a Japanese artillery officer, identifiable by his sword and the map case slung over his shoulder, walking with 3 enlisted men and a radio operator. The group moved cautiously, scanning the jungle, aware that American snipers were active. Henderson tracked them through his scope, waiting for the officer to stop. The officer paused near a fallen log, consulting his map. Henderson fired. The round struck the officer in the upper chest. He collapsed. The radio operator dove for cover. Henderson fired again, missing. The enlisted men scattered into the jungle. Henderson heard shouting, Japanese voices calling for medics, for covering fire. Then he heard something else: the distinctive sound of a Type 92 heavy machine gun being set up somewhere along the trail. The Japanese had positioned a machine gun team specifically to hunt for the sniper who'd been killing their men. Henderson didn't wait for the artillery. He crawled into the nearest ghost zone, a cluster of volcanic boulders covered by dense ferns, and waited. The machine gun opened fire, raking the area where Henderson had been positioned. Hundreds of 7.7mm rounds tore through the jungle, shredding vegetation, splintering trees. The barrage lasted 90 seconds. Then the artillery started. This time, the Japanese were using a different pattern. Instead of concentrating fire on a single point, they were bracketing the entire area, walking the shells across 200 yards of jungle, saturating every possible hiding spot. Over 200 rounds fell in 10 minutes. The ghost zone shook with each impact. Shrapnel and debris rained down through the fern canopy, but the volcanic boulders absorbed the blast. Henderson pressed himself against the rock and waited. When the barrage ended, Henderson heard Japanese voices, a patrol moving through the smoking jungle, searching for his body. They were 80 yards away, moving cautiously, weapons ready. Henderson had his M1903A4 and 8 rounds remaining in his ammunition pouch. He also had 2 fragmentation grenades and his M1911 pistol. If the patrol found his ghost zone, he'd be in close quarters combat against at least 6 men. The patrol moved closer. Henderson could hear individual voices now, see movement through the ferns. 60 yards, 50 yards. The patrol leader, a sergeant based on his uniform, was sweeping the area with methodical precision, checking every depression, every cluster of vegetation. Henderson waited, barely breathing. The patrol reached the edge of the ghost zone. One soldier was 15 yards away, his rifle raised, scanning the boulders. Henderson's hand was on his pistol grip, ready to fight his way out. Then, a Marine artillery battery, 105mm howitzers positioned near the beach perimeter, opened fire on a different section of the Japanese ridge. The explosions were distant, but loud enough to get the patrol's attention. The patrol leader shouted orders. The men turned and moved back toward the trail, heading toward the artillery impact area. Henderson exhaled slowly. He'd been seconds away from dying in a firefight that would have revealed his position to every Japanese unit in the sector. Instead, random American artillery had saved him. He waited until dusk, then moved north along a parallel route, avoiding Piva Trail entirely. By midnight, he'd established a new sector, 1,200 yards from his previous position. The Japanese would spend the next day searching the wrong area. Again. By November 7th, Henderson had 34 confirmed kills. Japanese command had issued specific orders: find and kill the American sniper operating along Piva Trail. They'd deployed dedicated counter-sniper teams, experienced marksmen with scoped rifles tasked with hunting Henderson specifically. The Japanese knew his general operational area. They knew his preferred range, 350 to 500 yards. They knew he was targeting officers and observers. What they didn't know was his ghost zone technique, and that ignorance was costing them lives. Henderson killed 2 Japanese snipers on November 7th. The first was positioned in a tree 60 yards from Piva Trail, watching for American movement. Henderson spotted the sniper's rifle barrel reflecting morning light and put a round through the man's chest at 410 yards. The second sniper was more skilled, well concealed in dense vegetation, disciplined enough to remain motionless for hours. But he made one mistake. He'd positioned himself with no overhead cover, assuming American artillery wouldn't target his area. Henderson killed him at 475 yards, then crawled into his ghost zone and waited as Japanese artillery demolished the hillside. Over 180 rounds. The ghost zone held. On November 8th, Henderson's technique evolved again. He'd noticed that Japanese artillery observers were becoming more cautious after the first shot, diving for cover immediately, making follow-up shots nearly impossible. So Henderson started using suppressed movement patterns to force targets into specific positions. He'd fire a single shot near, not at, a target, deliberately missing. The target would instinctively move toward cover, often into a pre-identified position where Henderson had a clearer shot. Then he'd fire the killing round. The technique worked. Henderson killed 5 Japanese soldiers on November 8th using this method. Officers and radio men who'd repositioned themselves directly into his crosshairs while seeking cover from his missed first shot. The Japanese artillery response was immediate and massive, over 290 rounds across multiple barrages throughout the day. Henderson moved between 3 different ghost zones, never staying in one location longer than 90 minutes. By November 9th, the Japanese had changed tactics. Instead of using artillery after every sniper shot, they started deploying rapid reaction infantry patrols, 20 to 30 men who would saturate the area immediately after shots were fired, attempting to trap the sniper before he could relocate. Henderson adapted. He started using ghost zones with multiple exit routes, positions that allowed him to crawl out in 3 different directions depending on where the patrol approached from. He'd wait until the patrol entered the area, then slip out through an alternate route while the Japanese searched the wrong position. On one occasion, a Japanese patrol passed within 10 yards of Henderson's ghost zone while he remained completely motionless, covered in mud and vegetation. The patrol spent 40 minutes searching the area, then moved on. Henderson waited another hour, then relocated. By November 10th, 6 days after beginning operations along Piva Trail, Henderson had 93 confirmed kills. The 9th Marines had advanced 1,200 yards inland with significantly lower casualties than other regiments, largely because Japanese artillery observers and forward commanders had been systematically eliminated. Henderson had been targeted by an estimated 900 artillery rounds, countless machine gun barrages, and at least 15 dedicated infantry patrols. He'd sustained 0 injuries. On November 11th, Henderson was pulled back to the perimeter and ordered to report to division headquarters. A lieutenant colonel he'd never met shook his hand and asked him to explain his technique in detail. Henderson spent 3 hours describing the ghost zone method, the micro-terrain analysis, the pre-positioning strategy. The lieutenant colonel took notes. Within 2 weeks, modified versions of Henderson's technique were being taught to Marine Scout-Sniper Platoons across the Pacific. The official documentation called it prepared concealment with layered fallback positions. Marines called it Hollywood's Ghost Zones, named after Henderson's nickname. By December 1943, Marine sniper casualties had decreased by 40% in units that adopted the technique. The battle for Bougainville continued until March 1944, but Henderson's role in the Piva Trail sector ended on November 11th. He'd accomplished what higher command had tasked him with: disrupt Japanese supply lines, eliminate key personnel, and survive long enough to make a difference. 93 confirmed kills in 6 days, 0 friendly casualties from his overwatch positions, and a tactical innovation that would save Marine lives for the rest of the Pacific War. Henderson was promoted to staff sergeant in December 1943 and assigned to train new scout sniper platoons at Camp Pendleton, California. He spent 8 months teaching the ghost zone technique to Marine snipers heading to Saipan, Guam, and Peleliu. He never spoke about the fear, the moment when Japanese patrols were 15 yards away, searching for him while he lay motionless in volcanic rock. He never described the weight of knowing that 93 men had died because he'd pulled a trigger. He focused on the technique: scout terrain, identify micro-positions, pre-position fallback zones, move laterally, not linearly, wait for darkness. In April 1944, Henderson requested reassignment to a combat unit. He returned to the Pacific as part of the 4th Marine Division and participated in the invasion of Saipan in June 1944. He was killed on June 18, 1944, not by a sniper, not by artillery, but by a random mortar round that landed near his position while he was moving between ghost zones. He was 29 years old. The Marine Corps awarded him the Navy Cross posthumously. The citation mentioned his extraordinary heroism and tactical innovation during operations on Bougainville. It did not mention the 93 confirmed kills, the 900 artillery rounds that failed to kill him, and the technique that changed how Marine snipers fought for the rest of the war. Staff Sergeant John Hollywood Henderson is buried in Flagstaff, Arizona. His family donated his M1903A4 Springfield rifle to the National Museum of the Marine Corps in Quantico, Virginia, where it remains on display today. The ghost zone technique he developed in Bougainville's jungle became standard doctrine in the Marine Corps Scout-Sniper School by 1945. Modern Marine snipers still learn variations of Henderson's method: pre-positioned fallback positions, micro-terrain analysis, lateral movement under fire. 93 enemies, 6 days, 900 artillery rounds that missed. One Marine who understood that survival wasn't about running faster, it was about knowing exactly where to hide while the world exploded around you. If this story moved you, hit that like button right now. Every like tells YouTube this history matters. Subscribe and turn on notifications. We're bringing forgotten heroes back from the archives every single week. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. United States, United Kingdom, Australia, Canada? Our community spans the globe, and you're part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served. Just let us know you're here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for making sure John Hollywood Henderson's story is never forgotten.